Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Let's continue with the survey instruments. Survey in general, it is one of the methods to evaluate the usability and the user experience of any product or any interface. Surveys usually are written as a hard copy or an online. It is very common because it is kind of cheap and it is familiar for many people to respond to questions at their free time. So it is kind of acceptable companion for usability tests. Okay, so keys to successful surveys are to set clear goals in advance and then to develop focused items, or in other words, like questions that help attain these goals. So, how to prepare and design survey questions? You or we need, as surveyors or those that are going to use surveys as a method to evaluate the usability of our interface or our product, is to prepare the questions. Usually there is a form that you need to set your goals or the survey goals, the research questions that you are going to address, and then even the ethical consent, you can include it or you have to include it on the survey form. Usually it is highly recommended to have it be reviewed by colleagues. You can have it as similar to a pilot test that we talked about on part one of this chapter regarding the usability experiment, that you can have some or a small sample of users to take to undertake the experiment. Here it is the same. We can have either our peers like colleagues, classmates, and or even a small group or a small sample from the real targeted audience of that survey, to ask them to carry out that survey and to give us their initial feedback. Whether, for example, there are some questions that are unclear, there are some questions that may carry more than one meaning, so they need to be elaborated, rephrased, and so on. There are typos, and so on. Methods of statistical analysis. We need to determine the methods for the intended statistical analysis that we need. So based on that, we can tweak our questions to meet or to be useful for those statistical analysis methods that we are going to use afterwards. We have means, for example, standard deviation, and other presentations like histogram, scatter plots, and so on. We need to consider on carrying out surveys that we need to have unbiased samples. So it is better to have such a diverse respondents' backgrounds, diverse respondents' genders, and so on, ages, and so on. This may lead to have a more credible and accurate results that we can generalize later on. So we need to verify that respondents represent the population of the earth, or the targeted population for a specific organization, for example, or specific country, and so on, in terms of age, gender, experience, background, and other relevant characteristics. It is important, as we said, to pre-test or pilot test any survey instrument prior to actual use. Based on the outcome of this pilot test, we can tweak, we can amend, customize the survey, the questions, the consent, and so on, the options, even the choices of questions, scale, and etc. So users can be asked for their subjective impressions about specific aspects of the interface, such as the representation of task domain, objects, actions, interface domain, metaphors, and action handles, syntax, data of inputs, and design or screens, and so on. It might be useful to ascertain specific characteristics about the users. They are to be considered while asking or prior to asking the actual survey questions. We need to consider the background, or in other words, it is called demographics, age, gender, origins, native language, education, income, etc. That we think that it might be relevant, or it might affect or be affected by that interface, or by the responses to our questions, that we can utilize these demographic backgrounds on our analysis. We can even ask about the experience of or with computers, specific applications or software packages, length of time, depth of knowledge, whether the knowledge was acquired through formal training or self-teaching, and so on. This might assist our analysis later on. If, for example, the responses of this respondent is that he doesn't know how to deal with this interface, or it is unclear to him how to do a specific task on this interface, and so on, and then we realize from his experience with computers that he lacks experience with dealing with computers in general, or with this specific operating system that we have our interface be running on it, and so on. So there might be a correlation between these. So as for example, the reason behind the dissatisfaction of that respondent, that his lack of familiarity with this operating system or computers in general, not the lack of or the lack of the good design of our proposed interface and so on. Other things that we can consider, or it is recommended to ask the respondents on the survey, in addition to the main part, that the job responsibilities, decision making, influence, managerial roles, and motivation, and so on. Personality style, introvert, unsociable, or extrovert, sociable, risk taking or risk aversive, early or late adopter, systematic or opportunistic, and so on. Any surrounding, psychological or physical or educational or ethnicity and so on, that we may think that it will affect or be affected by the outcome or the results of the survey, it is recommended to ask. But of course, we need to avoid having very lengthy surveys. So, reasons for not using an interface: inadequate services, or too complex, too slow, afraid. You need to ask about them. Familiarity with features, printing, macros, shortcuts, tutorials, feeling after using an interface, confused, clear, frustrated or in control, bored, excited, and so on. This is, of course, in addition to the main questions about the specific tasks, specific actions, specific menus, and so on. It is highly recommended, especially nowadays in this technological era. It is highly recommended to use online surveys to avoid the cost of printing and the extra effort needed for distribution and collection of paper forms, and the efforts needed to enter them into uh, a system or in a digital form in order to be utilized for the analysis and so on. Having an online survey will help us on avoiding all of these. Many people prefer to answer a brief survey displayed on a screen instead of filling in and returning a printed form. Although there is a potential bias in the sample, as some sects or some part of the population that will be unreachable or difficult to be reached online. However, some companies that provide computerized surveys include some features that they can distribute this survey using different forms of communication, like social websites or emails and others. Some of the website or surveys providers nowadays are SurveyMonkey, Survey Gizmo, Qualtrics, and Question Proof. Here are some samples of questionnaires. You can access them or search about them during your free time. Questionnaire for user interaction satisfaction, system usability scale, computer system usability questionnaire, software usability measurement inventory, website analysis and measurement inventory, the mobile phone usability questionnaire, and so on. You can have some samples of the surveys and questionnaires in the book, page 188 and 171. So what about the acceptance test? What are the acceptance tests? Briefly, acceptance testing is a test conducted to determine if the requirements of a specification or contract are met by a test for system or interfaces acceptability. So here we assume that there is a requirements set by the organization or specification or contract between the designers and the company or any corporate that is going to utilize or to adopt this interface or product in general. So here we are doing an acceptance test to verify whether these requirements or the conditions or points set on the contract are achieved or not. If they are achieved, to what extent does it lead to acceptability or not? So for large implementation projects, the customer or manager usually sets objective and measurable goals for hardware and software performance. In the completed product if the completed product fails to meet these acceptance criteria, these set requirements or specifications, the system must be reworked until success is demonstrated. Rather than the vague and misleading, meaningless criterion of user-friendly, just it is be that the product has to be user-friendly. What does it mean? It is very big, very general. Measurable criteria for the user interface can be established for the following. Based on these following criteria, we can decide or we can tell whether it is user-friendly or not. We need to measure the time for users to learn specific functions, speed of task performance, rate of errors by users, user retention of commands over time. If we ask them after 5 minutes or 1 day to do the same function or the same task, will the user remember how to do it? Has he retained the commands of it over time or not? Or no, he needs to read about it or to learn from the beginning how to do it. And the fifth criterion here is subjective user satisfaction. So subjective user satisfaction is not enough. It is subjective, it is biased, but it is just that the user saying yes, I like it, or not like it, or semi like it. So, no, it is not enough. It can be considered as 1/5 of the other criteria. So since the choice of the benchmark tasks is critical, pilot testing must be done to refine the materials and procedures used. So again, pilot testing is important, similar to what we said on the usability testing, the experiment, survey, the same here. So here is an example of an acceptance test for a food shopping, or let's take this more relevant one. It is okay. Let's talk about this for food shopping website. We can use this. The participants will be 35 adults, their age from 25 to 45 years old, native speakers with no disabilities, hired from an employment agency. They will have moderate web use experience. So if they are very novice or they are not familiar with using websites, so they are not considered as suitable, let's say, participants. 1 to 5 hours per week for at least a year. So they use it. So they will be given a 5-minute demonstration on the basic features of that food shopping website, and then at least 30 of the 35 adults should be able to complete the benchmark tasks within 30 minutes. If less than 30 are able to complete it, so there is a need for refinement. Otherwise, if it is 30 and above, so it is acceptable. Another testable requirement for the same interface might be this. Special participants in 3 categories will also be tested. 10 older adults aged from 55 to 65, another category or group 10 adult users with varying motor, visual, and auditory disabilities, and 10 adult users who are recent immigrants and use English as a second language. Here, for example, you can try that the diversity of the website and accessibility is going to be tested here. A third item in the acceptance test plan might focus on retention. 10 participants will be recalled after 1 week and asked to carry out a new set of benchmark tasks. In 20 minutes, at least 8 of the participants should be able to complete the tasks correctly, and so on. You can set the acceptance test plans for your interface or your product based on the goal of your acceptance test. Okay? In a large interface or system, there may be 10 or 8 or 10 such tests to carry out on different components of the interface and with different user communities. Okay, but again, it depends on the goal of the acceptance test or of the product itself. If its goal or its targeted audience to target adults from 18 to 30, for example, only. So it is enough to have our targeted participants to be within these age groups, within these age limits. But if it is aimed at more participants or more diverse groups of people, so we are recommended to include as much and as diverse as possible of participants. Other criteria that can be tested for acceptancy is like subject satisfaction, as we said, output, comprehensibility, system response time, installation procedures, documentation, graphic appeals, and so on. They are also considered in acceptance tests to complete for commercial products and others. So the central goal of acceptance testing is not to detect flaws, but rather to verify adherence to requirements. After successful acceptance testing, there may be real after successful acceptance testing, there may be a period of field testing or an extensive beta test with real users before national or international distribution, before public distribution or release. Important here note is that the goal of early expert reviews, usability testing, surveys, and acceptance testing and field testing is to force as much as possible of the evolutionary development into the pre-release phase, when change is relatively easy and less expensive to accomplish. So the importance, the, the criticality and necessity of all of these four tests or usability tests or evaluations in general: expert reviews, usability testing, surveys, acceptance, and field testing, is to reach the optimal shape of the product pre-releasing it, before releasing it, before putting it into practice, before putting it into the field to be used in reality. So, because we are still in the development process before the final product, so we can tweak it, we can customize and amend it as much as possible to reach the best shape of it, the best version of it. But we have to keep in mind that after releasing it, after putting it into real practice, there might be some flaws or some bugs that will be realized afterwards, but it is normal and they can be patched, but it is more likely to be more expensive to do changes afterwards. Now let's move to the evaluation during active use or and beyond, after releasing. So all these four that we talked about are pre-release phase. Now here we are going to talk about after release, during the active use. A carefully designed and thoroughly tested interface is a wonderful asset, but successful active use requires constant attention from dedicated managers, user services personnel, and maintenance staff. Perfection is not attainable, as we said, but incremental improvements, gradual improvements, are possible and are worth pursuing. One methods of evaluations during active use and beyond, some of them are similar to the pre-release one, but with minor differences between them. One of them is interviews and focus group discussions. Interviews with individual users can be productive because the interviewer can pursue a specific issue of concern and discuss it, ask more clarification, and so on. Group discussions are valuable to ascertain the universality of comments. And as we said before, having more than one interviewee, one evaluator at a time, might be more productive than having one-on-one. Continuous user performance, data logging. So the logging here is important. Registering, recording log files for all activities of usage of that product is essential. The software architecture should make it easy for system managers to collect data about the patterns of system usage, speed of user performance, rate of errors, frequency of requests for online assistance. The results of those data may help us, aid us to come to a conclusion that an intervention is needed, a more analysis is needed for this, an improvement in this area is needed, and so on. Online or chat consultants, email, and online suggestion boxes can be utilized as well to while active use to take notes, take comments, feedbacks, and so on. Many users feel reassured if they know there is a human assistance available. On some network systems, the consultants can monitor the user's computer and see the same displays that the user sees. Online suggestion box or email trouble reporting, electronic email for feedback, for maintenance, for designers, for webmasters, admin, and so on. For some users, writing a letter may be seen as requiring too much effort. So if there is a box just to write whatever you have faced and then press send or submit, it will be much more easier and more usable and convenient for the users than going to their email portal and writing an email. Discussion groups, wikis, news groups, and search permit postings of open messages and questions. Some are independent, like America Online and Yahoo. Topic lists, sometimes moderators, social systems, comments, and suggestions should be encouraged. And of course, there might be a review, a closer look to them from time to time, and even an in-depth analysis in order to infer from them what is needed to be done. There are some tools even for automated evaluation, like the automated evaluation tool from TechSmith's Mori. The item being measured is mouse clicks. So it is taking a log of the mouse clicks for different purposes. For example, this shows the view for task 2, selected in the tabbed bar. Here, task 2. Obviously, the other three tasks could also be displayed, but these are the values for participant 4. So this is the density of the clicks, and this is the time stamp. So the drop-down list box would allow the evaluators to choose the mouse clicks for other participants across the horizontal axis time. The last, evaluation and user experience. The method is controlled, psychologically oriented experiment. So a controlled experiment is a scientific test that is directly manipulated, i.e. independent variable, by a scientist in order to test a single variable at a time. Okay, so we have here two types of variables. We have the independent variables, or sometimes it is defined as IV, which is the variable that is going to be manipulated, to change, to controlled. And on the other side that we are going to test is another variable called dependent variable. Okay, that, or sometimes it's called DV. It is going to be changed according to the change of the independent variable. For example, if we have time, for example, of usage, and we have the number of errors, two variables here, error rate and time of usage. Now we are going to do a controlled experiment. We are going to change or manipulate the independent variable here, which is the time of usage, and based on it we will see whether the rate of the errors will change based on the time or not. So here the independent is the time of usage and the dependent is the error rate. For example, the time from 7 to 9 a.m. and we see that the error rate is 20% error rates, percentage of error. Let's change the time now of usage to 4 to 5 p.m. in the afternoon. So the error rate is now 40%. So we can infer here that in the early morning the error rate is less than the late afternoon, and so on. So there are experimental approaches here, Academic and industrial researchers are conducting numerous experiments that aid in better understanding of basic design principles. You can have a look at this YouTube clip to understand it more. So the outline here of the scientific method as applied to human-computer interaction might comprise these tasks. First, understand a practical problem and consider the theoretical framework, the related theory. State a clear statement of a testable hypothesis. So this is our hypothesis that the error rates is or change the error rates change by time between early morning and late afternoon, and then we will see whether this is true or not. We will test this hypothesis whether it is true or not. Identify a small number of independent variables that are to be manipulated. Carefully choose the dependent variables that will be measured. Dependent. That will depend on the independent. Judiciously select subjects and carefully or randomly assign subjects to groups. Subjects like participants, respondents. Control for biasing factors. Non-representative sample of subjects or selection of tasks, inconsistent testing procedures, and so on. Control them. Then apply statistical methods to data analysis. It is not random analysis, biased analysis, but statistical methods should be applied. And finally, the outcome. Resolve the practical problem. Refine the theory. Is it true or not? If it is not, we need to refine it, correct it, and give advice to future researchers for future work, of course. So through multiple repetitions with similar tasks, participants are and experimental conditions, reliability and validity can be enhanced. Managers of actively used systems are also coming to recognize the power of controlled experiments in fine-tuning the human-computer interface. A carefully controlled experiment can provide data to support a management decision. Dependent measures may include performance times, user subjective satisfaction, error rates, and retention over time. For example, the competition over mobile device input methods has led to numerous experimental studies of keyboard arrangements with similar training methods, standard benchmark tasks, common dependent measures that account for error rates, and strategies for testing frequent users. Such careful controls are necessary because a 10 minutes reduction in learning time, a 10% speed increase, or 10 fewer error rates, 10 fewer errors could be a vital advantage in a competitive consumer market. That the user satisfaction may increase that will lead to retaining or acquiring, adopting our product more than our competitors and so on. So the experimental design should be set carefully. A full discussion of experimental design is outside the scope of this book. Although many excellent resources exist, see references for Chapter 5, page 200. Experimental design and statistical analysis are complex topics. Novice experimenters would be well advised to collaborate with experienced research scientists and statisticians to develop the details properly. The following are some basic terminologies and methodologies that you can consider while doing the experimental design. Representative sample, selecting the appropriate participants that will represent the population, the targeted audience, the targeted users of that product. Demographic, as we said, categorize or group the users by age, gender, education, and other attributes. Sampling technique. How do we select our sample of those participants? Are people selected randomly? Is there a stratified subsample that should be used? Novice researchers may want to use their friends and family, which is easier to recruit, to create convenient sample, but not typically representative. They may be most of them from the same ethnicity, from the same education level, or from the same even age group, or the same gender, which is maybe biased, which can compromise the confidence and validity of the results, the credibility of the results. Confidence level is how sure you can be in percentage about the hypothesis or research questions. Is it true 100% or false, null 100%, or in between it is 90%, 80% true or so? That is called confidence level. Counterbalance here, it is counterbalance from it started counter like the opposite. So the order of the tasks can affect the results. Thus, counterbalance the tasks is important. If the variable being measured is ease of use, for example, real tasks may artificially seem more difficult because the user is not yet familiar with the system. Likewise, later tasks may be seen as easier not because the tasks themselves are less complex, but because of the familiarity with the system that the user has acquired throughout using the system. So we may change the order of the tasks and see the effect, whether this is true or not. We talked about independent variables and dependent variables. Let's just go through them again. Independent variables, it is something that is being manipulated. For example, you may have two different interfaces with two different designs, one that provide access to a help system and one that doesn't. Dependent variables, it is something that happens as a result of the experiment and is usually measured. Examples include time to complete the task, number of errors, and user satisfaction, as we said. So experimental design here needs to be carefully controlled. So the main differences found in the dependent variables can be attributed to the independent variables, not other outside sources or confounding variables counterbalance. To help control for potential systematic bias and experimental error in the study design, the researcher should apply randomization strategies such as random selection of participants and random assignments of participants to testing. Basic experimental designs come into two forms: between subjects and within subjects. So the between subject design, each group is given a different treatment to have a powerful effect. This design approach needs to have a relatively large number of users, participants in each group. Why? The large sample size usually ensures that groups are similar in nature, so differences can be attributed primarily to the different treatment. If the groups are too small, the results may be related to the individual characteristics of each group. The other form is within subject design. That is between subject, the first one between subject, so we have different treatment for each group. Here within subjects, each participant performs the same tasks and the data being recorded are compared across participants. So the same tasks with one participant, for example, is compared with the rest of the remaining participants. Although the sample size can be smaller here, there may still be concerns about fatigue like exhaustiveness, tiredness, causing performance to decrease by time, or practice and familiarity, causing performance to increase with the familiarity. Okay, now we have come to the end of this chapter. I wish you all the best. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.